It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Robert Demaine, who, as you can see from the slide that you can see, is going to talk about the voyage of the Burmantofts, a forgotten chapter in the history of Leeds as an inland port. So Robert's in better voice than I am, but over to you, Robert. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Alan, and good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here and speak to you about the voyage of the Burmantofts, a subject which has rather obsessed me for quite some time. If I might just explain briefly the origins of this particular talk, it came from a chance discovery when I came across in the not very well-known publication Railway and Transport Monthly, which lasted for about 10 years in the early 20th century. In their issue for August 1919 was a short piece, intriguingly entitled Leeds to Brussels by Cargo Steamer. Now, it turns out that that vessel was in fact not a cargo steamer as such, but it was the Burmantofts, which was owned by the Leeds firm of Albrecht and Albrecht, wholesale manufacturing clothiers and woolen merchants, who at the time operated in a large factory on Hudson Road. Those premises would actually be shortly acquired by Montagu Burton, and the site developed into one of the largest clothing factories in Europe, which of course are a familiar landmark to generations of Leeds people. Now, as my research progressed, a remarkable story emerged, which forms the basis of my presentation this evening. And at this point, I would like to offer my sincere thanks to the Albrecht family for granting me access to their archive, and in particular to the collection of unpublished photographs of the voyage, one of which you see here on this opening slide. So why was this voyage undertaken? Well, we need to go back to early 1919, not long after the signing of the armistice. Now, Albrecht and Albrecht had done very well out of the war, and with its demand for uniforms and other woolen goods. But they recognized that to maintain profitability in peacetime, the company would need to resume its extensive export business. Now, much of this was with the British Empire, notably South Africa, but also to continental Europe, where in pre-war days, the company had agencies in places like Hamburg and Brussels, Paris, and Milan. And herein lay the problem. 4 years of war had significantly damaged large areas of transport infrastructure in Europe. In Belgium alone, the retreating German army had destroyed hundreds of miles of railway track, as well as docks, bridges, and canals. In addition to that, many ports in the UK and abroad had become badly congested for a variety of reasons, with the result that exporters were faced with costly delays and inconvenience in getting their goods to market. Now, a major source of delay was transshipment, that is the transfer of goods from one mode of transport to another en route to a destination. So this might mean transferring from a railway wagon to a cargo steamer to a canal barge, for example. Now, Horace Albrecht, who was the company chairman, and with his brother Siegfried, was responsible for the running of Albrecht and Albrecht, decided to try what the Yorkshire Post describes as an interesting experiment. His solution was simple enough in concept, but far from easy to execute. And this was namely to acquire a suitable boat, load it with a consignment of woolen goods in Leeds, and using inland waterways and a passage across the North Sea, deliver the cargo directly to his agents in Brussels, and thereby avoid the bottleneck of transshipment. Now, this map, which hopefully will work, will it work? It should work. First technical problem. There we go. And this map shows the extent of the voyage, and you can see Leeds in the top left-hand corner there, and Brussels down in the bottom right. So the journey would take from Leeds down the Aire and Calder navigation towards Hull and the Humber estuary, go close down the eastern coast, and actually call in at Great Yarmouth, which is about halfway to the distance, that's 200 miles, Then down on towards the West Schelde estuary. You can see where a place called Middelburg, I hope this comes out, and that leads on into Antwerp, and then by Antwerp by canal down to Brussels. Total distance just over 400 miles. So quite an undertaking. So this was quite an audacious plan by any standards. It was a radical departure from what had gone before. Seagoing vessels had appeared in Leeds as early as 1901 with the SS Pioneer, which you can see here, unloading 130 tons of China clay from Cornwall on Warehouse Hill. But no one had ever delivered a cargo from Leeds to an inland port on the continent directly without recourse to transshipment. So this was totally new. Now, Horace Albrecht set about purchasing a vessel, but very quickly was persuaded by his brother Siegfried to enlist the help of someone who really knew about this stuff, a much better qualified judge of seaworthiness. And this is in the form of his personal friend, Rear Admiral Edward Weems. Now, Weems's last command had actually been a 16,000-ton battleship with a crew of almost 700 people. I looked at his naval record in the National Archives, and it doesn't actually make for very good reading, and he left under something of a cloud. Unlike his cousin, Rosalind Weems, who actually rose to be First Sea Lord and was appointed in 1917. Nonetheless, Weems was a friend of the Albrechts, and he not only offered to procure a boat for them, but also to equip and skipper it for the voyage. And his choice settled on a motor corbel built in Filey in 1908 and fitted with a 26 horsepower petrol power engine. Now, not everyone may know what a cobble is, but it's a type of boat which had a long history along the east coast of England from the Humber northwards, used by fishermen and pirates. And the ancestry of this particular design is believed to date back to Viking times. They were very robust and seaworthy boats, and their distinctive high prow, which you can see there, made them well suited to the rough seas of the North Sea. Now, during the war, this particular craft had been involved in herring fishing, just over 43 feet in length and with a gross registered tonnage of 13 tons. It was something of a change from HMS Caesar. The boat was registered in Hull under Siegfried's name and named Burmantofts in recognition of the old location of the Albrecht factory. Now, the boat drew about 6 feet when fully laden, and therefore could manage the inland waterways such as the Aire and Calder navigation and the Brussels to Villebroek Canal. But it could also, hopefully, withstand the rigors of the North Sea. But having said that, taking a vessel of this kind across open seas was not entirely without risk. And indeed, only weeks earlier, before they finally departed, a similar vessel had foundered off Filey with the loss of 2 lives. Beyond those dangers of the sea crossing, there are other factors which threatened the success of Horace's venture, not least the presence of uncleared mines in the North Sea. And at this time, we're talking now in June 1919, the Admiralty was still issuing regular updates to mariners to warn them of areas that still had mines in them. And indeed, the threat was very real, and even as late as April 1920, a Hull trawler was sunk by a mine after hitting a mine. Certainly, striking a mine in a boat like Burmantofts would not be a good idea. It would soon become matchwood and probably kill everybody on board. So it was not without dangers. And as for the Brussels Canal, the last section from Antwerp down to Brussels, there was no reliable intelligence as to whether or not that canal was even passable, given the damage that had been wrought by the retreating German army. Despite all this, completely undeterred, Horace Albrecht was determined to sail with Weems and conduct his business in Brussels. And to get a crew together, they engaged 2 military men, both in their 20s, who were persuaded to join the crew. Captain George Fox Priestley, MC, was Horace and Siegfried's cousin, and he came from a family of woolen merchants in Liversedge. He was still technically a serving officer in the Australian Army, where he'd been served with as an intelligence officer on the Western Front, been mentioned in dispatches. and he wasn't formally discharged until September 1919. There was also Lieutenant Ivan Franks, who was also still a serving officer, a naval officer, who had been granted half pay, a leave on half pay, to allow him to take up the voyage. He'd been instrumental in setting up the Zeebrugge raid of 1918, but had to not be able to take part in the action due to appendicitis, which probably saved him from being killed, since many people didn't survive that particular mission. They're also joined by 2 engineers and a former lift boy from a London club who's acting like a sort of cabin boy. I haven't got his name, fortunately. So on the 2nd of June 1919, a Monday, Burmantofts actually was sitting moored in the Erin Calder Navigation Wharf near Leeds Bridge, being loaded with 50 tons of miscellaneous woolen goods. I say miscellaneous because Horace Albrecht deliberately put a variety of goods in to test what the reaction of the customs and excise people would be as he took these goods through. So he wanted to see what kind of problems might occur as part of the experiment. Now, word must have got around quite quickly around the town that this little boat was there and what these guys were up to, because the Evening Post reported that hundreds of people had ventured out onto Warehouse Hill to take a look at it. So that's an interesting insight into how quickly those things work. Now, a small family group came the next day, which was Tuesday the 3rd, to take a look and to wish the bid farewell to the crew. On the left of this little group is Siegfried with a cane. You can see him, and there's the Admiral, dapper little figure, and then the 2 ladies are 2 wives of Siegfried and Horace, respectively. Some of you will no doubt recognise the scene in the background there, just across, not far from Leeds Bridge. And here's another view. Again, this is all from the Albrecht archive. Here's the Admiral. Can't see him very clearly there. Annie Albrecht was the mother of Horace and Siegfried, and she was also a director of the company. And that's Gladys, who was Siegfried's wife. Terrific in that 1919 outfit. So they came in to bid farewell, and off they set around 5 p.m. on that day. And the next day they arrived safely in Goole after an uneventful passage along the Erin Calder Navigation. So far, so good, but unfortunately, the wheels rather fell off, if I may use a wrong metaphor for a ship, as Horace Albrecht encountered his first serious difficulties straight away, where he was delayed in Goole for no less than a week by what the newspapers termed customs formalities. But it also seems highly probable that the regulations for change of use from a fishing vessel to a foreign-going trader had been overlooked by Wings, because this would necessitate an inspection by a Board of Trade surveyor and the painting of a plimsoll line on the hull to denote safe levels of loading. And here we see Horace Albrecht at Goole, and there is the plimsoll line. You can see the line with the BT on it, the Board of Trade, which looks pretty freshly painted. And indeed, the sharp-eyed will see that earlier pictures don't have that on the side of the vessel. So after this week's delay, which must have been pretty frustrating for all concerned, the Burmantofts finally left for Hull, where Weems had to sign on as master of the vessel, formally, at the Board of Trade. And there were quite a few eyebrows raised at a retired admiral coming in charge of a boat of this size. But nonetheless, that's what they did. It was in Hull where the first rumours about the voyage started, and one version of a rumour claimed that the aim of the voyage was to repatriate the remains of Captain Fryatt, who was a merchant seaman shipmaster executed in Bruges by the Germans in 1916. Yet another rumour said it was a clandestine mission to kidnap Kaiser Wilhelm, who was by now living in exile in Holland. None of this was even remotely true, of course, but never mind. After problems getting the engine started, the boat finally left Hull on the evening of Wednesday, the 11th of June, and 24 hours later she put into Great Yarmouth, having experienced very rough weather southwest of the gale and further recurrences of engine trouble. Now, for those technically minded, the petrol paraffin engine uses petrol to start and thereafter runs on paraffin. And these engines were notoriously unreliable, and this was something that would dog the crew for the rest of the time with the boat. While they were at Yarmouth, or more strictly Galston, where they were actually berthed that evening, another rumour surfaced, and this claimed that the voyage was actually a trial run to carry passengers at £100 a head to visit the battlefields of Belgium. So you can see the rumour mill was well in progress. Now, these engine repairs, they needed engine repairs, and it wasn't until Sunday the 15th that they could leave for Antwerp, taking a narrow, safe channel through the North Sea, which was used first during wartime, hopefully to avoid mines. And in theory, this sea crossing should have taken around about 36 hours, but bad weather again slowed progress. And during the night of the 16th, the engine failed again, leaving the boat drifting dangerously. Weems managed to raise sail, because you notice in the picture there is a sail, and he raised sail and managed to make Vlissingen, or some people call it Flushing, on the Dutch coast at the mouth of the Schelde by morning, and nobody got a wink of sleep. Now, fortunately, Vlissingen was home to both a naval dockyard and a shipbuilder's, and the Dutch extended every courtesy and assistance to the mariners, even fabricating new parts and rebuilding the engine in little over 24 hours. A smart piece of work, as Captain Priestley noted. And here we see, we see them leaving the Humber. In fact, I missed the thing there. So that's them sailing off down the Humber. And here they are in Vlissingen. You can see moored up there, having had their motor repaired. And here's Lieutenant Franks. You can recognize him. And if you can see, well, you may not, because in mine it's obscured by the window, but you can see in the background some distinctive houses. And that's, to the left is the photograph that enabled me to identify where he was standing, because none of these pictures tell you where they are. So this is a nice contemporary photograph of that area of Vlissingen, where Franks is standing. So there he is. So they had yet another delay, as I said, and then Antwerp was reached on the 20th of June, which is day 18 of the voyage, if you count all the delays and everything else. And here they had rather a frosty reception from the port authorities. Not entirely surprising, given that most of Antwerp's wealth was based exactly on the transshipment that Horace and his crew were trying to avoid. So they were not particularly pleased to see them, shall we say. And Weems needed all his powers of persuasion to secure permission to continue down the canal to Brussels. And just as in Leeds, word got around fairly swiftly that this little boat was around, and Horace recalls that seeing crowds of people along the banks of the canal to watch the boat go by. And fortunately, the canal had remained navigable despite the best efforts of the German army. And the canal operators even took the unusual step of opening locks during the night to allow the Burmantofts to complete the journey, a 7-hour journey down to Brussels. They arrived Saturday morning, early hours, 21st of June, 19 days after leaving Leeds. And there's Priestley, Captain Priestley, on the quayside of Brussels having a quick smoke. There he is. However, there was more bad news to follow, and no sooner they unloaded the cargo than Horace got the news from his agents that a combination of inflation and unfavourable currency changes meant that Albrecht and Albrecht would be making an estimated loss of almost £3,000 on the consignment of goods that they brought from Leeds. This translates into something like £180,000 in today's money. So that was quite a substantial loss. Now, the ever resourceful Horace was determined to recoup some of those losses, and he scoured Brussels for goods to bring back to England. And after some difficulty, but with characteristically stylish flamboyance, he secured a return cargo of 92 cases of champagne. Now, in the meantime, Weems was enjoying what he described as the most sumptuous meal I've tasted since the outbreak of the war. And food and drink seemed to have been readily available in post-war Brussels, much to the surprise of the crew. But there was only a very limited time to enjoy it, of course, as the Burmantofts had to soon be heading off back home up the canal, which they duly did, having loaded the champagne on board. They journeyed north back up the canal to Antwerp, and on day 23 of their voyage, set off back in earnest. A departure that was noted, incidentally, in the Gazette van Antwerpen. Many of the Dutch and Belgian newspapers did carry reports about the voyage, so it's quite an interesting sideline on how it was covered by the European press, as well as strong coverage in the UK press as well. Yet again, they were beset by really bad weather, awful weather, and Weems had to call in at Vlissingen to take shelter, and then he had to change course and head along the coast, which itself was a pretty dangerous place to be in bad weather. The Flemish banks are notorious, it'd be difficult, and had to call in at Calais. On that journey into Calais, the lifeboat was swept away. Things were so bad. So it was really tough. And the appalling conditions actually kept Weems and his crew in harbour in Calais for 2 more days. And it was in Calais that he lost the only other professional seaman in the crew, which was Lieutenant Franks, of course. He was already late back reporting for duty at the Admiralty, and his extended leave actually expired on the day after they left Antwerp. So we can only assume that he took the first available Channel ferry back to England. Not long after leaving Calais, on Monday the 30th of June, with the engine beginning to misfire again, they managed to pick up a tow from a friendly vessel heading north, and they took them as far as the Thames estuary before heading up the river. Now, despite having run out of the petrol they would need to actually restart the engine should it stop, they decided to press on, and so the Burmantofts chugged north. And in the midst of a tremendous thunderstorm between Lowestoft and Yarmouth, the engine stopped completely, leaving the boat unable to make any headway against the tide on a busy channel that was frequently used by coastal steamers. Happily, help came in the form of a kindly Lowestoft fisherman, who not only towed them into his home port, but also went into town to order hot breakfast for them all. But this good Samaritan was duly presented with a demand for £4, 2 shillings and 6pence from the harbour master for having towed them into port in contravention of a monopoly of towage operated by the Great Eastern Railway. And there was another run-in with authorities when the customs official got to hear of a boat loaded with liquor coming in with the fishing fleet. It was eventually resolved by the fixing of seals on the cargo, which were not to be broken until arrival at Leeds. Thankfully, the remainder of the journey passed largely without incident, barring a minor brush with customs, who took more than a passing interest in a boatload of champagne from Belgium. But eventually the Burmantofts docked at Leeds Bridge on Saturday, the 5th of July, 1919, having been away for 33 days. Now, viewed from today's perspective, the Albrecht experiment, which was undertaken with precious little regard for personal safety or comfort, might have seemed wildly optimistic or possibly even foolhardy. Conditions on board during the days of storm-tossed days were particularly grim. If you look here, here's the picture of the Admiral. There was a crude canvas tent, which you can see on the left of the picture, and it had a couple of bunks underneath. It was known as a cuddy, and it was the only place for shelter on what was otherwise an open boat. And more than once, the crew went for more than 36 hours without sleep. So it was a very harsh business indeed. But for all this, you can see that the voyage was actually perfectly in keeping with the national mood of the time, when the Sheffield Independent described it as the spirit of adventure in British nature. And it comes as no surprise, I think, to note that while Weems and his crew were at sea, other risky undertakings were in progress. So one of them was Alcock and Brown, familiar with first transatlantic flight that was taking place in their aircraft, and the R-34 airship did the first westbound journey, east to west, at the same time they were still at sea. Now, in interviews, Weems and Horace had always said this was a purely commercial venture designed to test the potential for direct transportation, but eventually, when they got back, they did confess it had also been a sporting adventure. And I think that sort of jolly picture of them on board shows they were having a pretty good time of it too, in many respects. Now, press reports locally and nationally hailed the enterprise as a success, and the Daily Telegraph believed it would have an important bearing on the trade between the two cities, Leeds and Brussels, even suggesting that a fleet of small vessels might regularly ply between them. The same newspaper also reported Horace's slightly misleading claim that Brussels had been reached in 5 days, which neatly sidestepped the long delays he'd actually experienced in Hull and Vlissingen. But as a proof of concept, it had actually been successful, but Weems and the Albrechts recognized that a larger, bigger, faster vessel, preferably powered by a diesel engine, would be needed to operate a commercially viable service, along with readily available return cargoes. Now, they'd been at pains to establish precisely what kind of vessel, type of vessel, size of vessel could navigate the canal, but ironically, these findings would not be of much relevance, given that in 1922, just a couple of years later, the Belgians would actually complete a long delayed upgrade of the waterway between Antwerp and Brussels and the Brussels port area, which would allow vessels of up to 3,000 tons to actually get down there. So the hoped for direct service from Leeds to Brussels never materialized, and you could say it was another false dawn for the often discussed future of Leeds as a seaport. Although, of course, the air and coal and navigation would continue to prosper into the future, carrying coal and other bulk cargoes very profitably between Leeds and the Humber. And in the decade which followed this voyage, there were intermittent proposals for a Leeds ship canal. The envious eyes had been cast across the Pennines towards Manchester, seeing what they'd done. But the estimated £10 million, which was at that time, to upgrade the air and coal and navigation, was never forthcoming. And finally, the question you've all been dying to ask, what became of the Champagne? Which was actually mostly Moët Chandon Brut Impérial 1911, for those who were interested. Now, some of the consignment was sold at auction in Leeds at the sale rooms of Messrs. Oliver Appleton and Kitchen on Lambs Lane, and the remainder was disposed of through the wine merchants Lambert, Parker and Gaines, who had premises on 34 Trinity Street. Unfortunately, in one final brush with officialdom, the sale landed the Albrechts in court in May 1920. Due to the unlicensed nature of the importation and sale, they'd inadvertently fallen foul of the Customs and Excise Finance Act 1910. And had they but known, 10 guineas would have secured them a license. But as it was, they'd received a fine of £15 and costs. But for all the fact that the voyage of the Burmantofts failed to advance the use of Leeds by seagoing vessels, I hope you'll agree that the enterprising and courageous Horace Albrecht was responsible for writing a fascinating chapter in the history of Leeds as an inland port. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert, for that most interesting talk. Do we have any questions? You can either type them into chat or unmute yourself and just ask the questions. While people are thinking about questions, can I ask, Robert, I assume you've had access to the ship's log or some form of diary?
No, I would dearly love to have such a thing, and I keep pestering the Albrecht family if they can dig out more things that they might have in their loft or basement. There was no log. There are official registration documents and so forth, but the timeline that I managed to secure was mostly through newspaper reports, which I said, of which there were many, sometimes conflicting, so I've had to steer a safe course through that, but that was mostly that. I would love to see a diary or something like that, which Horace or one of the other crew wrote, but sadly not. No.
Helen has asked, do you know what happened to the Burmantofts in following years?
The registration for the vessel ceased in 1923. I've got a couple of references to it coming in and out of Goole and Hull in the early 20s. But beyond that, I suspect that she may have been broken up in 1923.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions?
Stunned silence.
The Clive Woods now asks, what happened? Do you know what happened to the Albrecht business?
Oh, well, that's quite a long story. It's covered quite a lot by Katrina Honeyman in her book, Well Suited.
Right.
Times got very hard for them and things didn't work out too well. The sudden withdrawal of government contracts left them with huge amounts of material, actual raw material, which cost them very heavily, along with quite a few people. Maurice Beresford, in his book Leeds Chamber on the Leeds Chamber of Commerce, mentions that 1921 was a black year for woolens. So in fact, the business contracted, and they, as I mentioned, they sold the Hudson Road premises to Montague Burton, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Yes. The site there.
Thank you. A number of people have thanked you for the talk typed into chat. I'll pass those comments on to you after the meeting.